In Anna Quindlen's new novel, Alternate Side, the everyday hassles of life in New York City are a fractured reflection of the everyday realities of life in general.
Everything morphs and changes. And there's no place I've ever been that morphs and changes most consistently as New York City does.
For the couple at the center of Alternate Side, those small annoyances expose a deeper fear that the prosperous life they've built together on a quiet, coveted street isn't as solid as it appears.
This is about a moment when the block is shaken by an act of violence on the block that really reveals massive fault lines.
But despite that discontent, Alternate Side is also a love letter to New York, where Quindlen moved to attend college after growing up in New Jersey. In 1977, she joined a wave of young female reporters who literally changed the faces of the New York Times after they were hired as part of a settlement of a landmark class-action gender discrimination suit against the paper.
There had never been really any sort of central female character in the Times who had gotten pregnant. If I wanted to get a story on page one, all I had to do in the page one meeting was start to hyperventilate a little bit. Put it out front.
And when she later shifted gears to stay home with her children, she broke more barriers, becoming a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist and fulfilling her childhood dream of writing the kinds of novels readers cherish and hold on to as they wait for the chance to meet their favorite author.
Hi, how are you?
Find out how she did it with wit, grace, and guts in this edition of First Person, One-on-One with Anna Quindlen, presented by St. Louis County Library and media sponsors St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU, and HEC TV.
Anna Quindlen, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Explain for us what alternate side means.
Well, actually, when I first started on the book, I used alternate side because there's this parking aspect to it, which wound up being really a minor backdrop. But the truth is that by the time I was done, and I'd written about class, and I'd written about race, and especially I'd written about marriage and men and women, it worked on a whole lot of other levels. I'm not sure I could have kept the title if it had only referred to parking, but since it referred to kind of the gap, the chasm among and between people, it worked perfectly.
And the funny thing is, when you live in a city, it is actually a huge part of your daily existence.
The parking thing. Yeah, I mean, in New York, but everything in New York is a metaphor. But parking is a metaphor for power and control. It seems like such a little thing, but quality of life can often be so tenuous in New York City that having a place to put your car where your car stays and is not ticketed or towed becomes a metaphor for everything that New York City throws at you.
There are things that you are always powerless of in the face of, and sometimes there's good aspects to that, but it is always ever present.
Yeah, and I think life in New York is a kind of an extended metaphor for the lives of these characters too, because they would like things to be set. My job is set, my marriage is set, my kids are set. And what they learn is what we all know, which is nothing gets set. Everything morphs and changes. And there's no place I've ever been that morphs and changes most consistently as New York City does. I mean, you have a favorite restaurant, and 2 weeks later, you go to stop in there, and it's an empty storefront.
And as we get older, we're sort of more baffled by the fact that we can't find this plateau of where we can control things.
As we get older, we really think everything ought to be set. What? I did that yesterday, you know, that kind of thing.
So tell me about the story. Nora and Charlie, a long married couple, 2 children who are not quite out of the nest but on their way. And when we meet them, right, the talk is about parking.
Nora and Charlie live on a dead-end block in New York City, and it's a kind of a clannish place. There's a lot more clannishness and cliquishness and neighborhoodiness in Manhattan than people who don't live there think. And certainly their block is that kind of place. There's 2 groups of people on the block. There's the people who own the houses on the block, and there's the people who make life tenable for those people. The housekeepers, the nannies, and the handyman, Ricky, who takes care of all their places. And this is about a moment when the block is shaken by an act of violence on the block that really reveals massive fault lines, not only among the haves and have-nots and among the men and women, but between Nora and Charlie.
When we meet them, at what point is their marriage?
At the beginning of the book, they've been married for almost 25 years. And they have that kind of long marriage that many people have where, you know, there are little bumps, little ups and downs, but basically it's been 25 years. You know, there's a routine to it. And that's fine that there's a routine to it. So that when it's shaken, neither one of them knows quite how to handle that because it's out of the usual way of their marital life.
And they're at this strange point in life where different things are sort of rocking their world individually.
Well, they're at the point in life that we call middle age, which is when you realize that if certain things haven't happened for you, they're probably not going to happen for you. I think, in general, women tend to deal with aging better than men do for a variety of reasons. One is that our lives have been morphing and changing all along. Theirs have been fairly consistent. And the other thing is, you know, when friends of mine get to 50 or 60, and they're really important, they're judges or broadcast anchors or things like that, it's not uncommon for them to look around and say, I can't believe this is my life. When the men I know get to that point and they're not masters of the universe, they can't believe that they didn't have it all. We didn't expect to have it all. A lot of them did, and so I think they find aging much more challenging than we do.
You get the sense that some of these characters don't quite know what have it all was supposed to be either, but they know they don't have it.
It's that compare and contrast. I mean, they have really blessed lives, these people.
Affluent, right?
Yeah, they're prosperous, they have good jobs, they have nice kids, they can pay the tuition, everything's tootling along fine, but there is that sense, particularly if they were really aspirational, that somehow they didn't quite hit the mark.
And you get that sense, in a way, too, from, say, Charlie and...
Right. Nora says about Charlie that if he lived someplace else, he would be important. I mean, it's really hard to be important in New York. You go to some cocktail party and every darn guy in the room is a CEO of an investment banking house or the head of a think tank or something major, major, major. And so if you've simply climbed a certain way up the greasy pole and made some money and done well, if you were living in a kind of a medium-sized town someplace, you'd be the man. You know, you'd be the head of the Rotary Club. You'd probably be someone everyone wanted to have run for mayor. But in New York City, there's hundreds of thousands of you.
It's a story about a family and a block, but it's so suspenseful. How do you do that?
That's so interesting to me that you would say it's suspenseful, because I have no sense of that, in part because I know exactly what's going to happen.
True.
I mean, suspense only happens if you're thinking what happens next. And luckily for my editor, I knew what was going to happen next. But I do think there are moments when you start to feel the cracks in something, when the earth...
The tension building.
Yeah, and the earth seems a little shaky underneath your feet. And I think from the very beginning that's true here.
In one of the interviews you did just recently, you talked a little bit about endings and whether, as a novelist, you don't necessarily always know how you're going to get to them or exactly how it's going to play out, but am I quoting you correctly?
My experience is that I know exactly how the book's going to begin. And I usually have a good idea of how it's going to end, but the middle is where all the work gets done. And the middle is the hardest part. I mean, there comes a point about 2/3 of the way through where you think you've wasted your life and no one's going to read this. But it's also the most exciting part because it's the part where the discovery comes, where you type a paragraph and think, oh, that's what happens next. So that while you sort of know the overall shape of the thing, all those stops along the number line are what you discover as you're sitting down and writing.
Your sentences are so clean and deliberate. Is that how it comes out the first time? They're so crafted.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm a first draft writer. No.
How long does it take to get to that? Yeah.
My first drafts are okay, but there always needs to be a second. And there's substantial annotation on the manuscript by my editor. Not so much to smooth my writing. I mean, God, I've been writing for money since I was 18 years old.
Right, this is your 9th novel, is that right?
This is my 9th novel, but I wrote for newspapers for years. And smoothing my sentences is a little bit of it, but most of it is this description slows down the story. We need to know more about him earlier in the book to care about him. Why don't we move up chapter 4 so it becomes chapter 2? It tends to be much more structural than stylistic.
Like the pacing and...
Yes, yes.
What's your favorite part of writing?
When it's over. No,
I agree.
Seriously.
Oh, I believe that.
Absolutely, when it's over.
Do you hit a sweet spot, though, where you're like, oh, yeah, this is why I do this?
Every once in a while, gosh, I've got to figure out who gave me this quote. I read a quote, I think it's from Borges, but I'm not sure, that said that when your work is going well, it's the closest a human being ever comes to levitating. And every once in a while you have a day where you sit down as usual and think, why do I do this? I'm so bad at this. This is terrible. And you start typing, and the next thing you know, you look up and 90 minutes have gone by. And that's what you live for. The rest of the time you're pushing the rock uphill, but every once in a while, the rock just flies.
I love how I can feel all these pieces of your own life in these characters in little ways.
You're never conscious of it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because
it's just what kind of feels right.
I mean, you know, what you bring to the table as a novelist is who you are and everything you've seen, and then everything that you can imagine. But even the things that you imagine grow out of your life experiences. So it's a little like sausage. You know, it all gets, everything you've done and been and heard and seen gets ground up and comes out in a different form.
And in this case, Nora shares something with your real life as well, in that she lost her mother at a young age.
Yeah, but that's such a completely different setup. I mean, you know, she says, my story is different from any other dead mother story I've ever heard, because her mother was kind of a negligible presence in their life when they were growing up. And then their father remarries to somebody who turns out to be absolutely wonderful, and really wonderful for Nora's sister, Christine, who is younger than she is. So it's a whole turnaround on that, you know. And I guess, gosh, in Rise and Shine, both the sisters' parents are gone. In Miller's Valley, of course, the parents are major figures, but that's because it starts when Mimi Miller is quite young. So there's all different kinds of iterations of parental relationships throughout my novels.
You have always been very open in talking about your own experience of when your mother died. But I wonder, is the loss sharper even now?
Well, I think the thing I feel over and over again is that I'm sort of living for two, and that I get to have all kinds of experiences that my mother just would have loved to have had. I now have an almost 2-year-old grandson, and my mother would have loved to have had grandchildren. So every time something like that happens, I feel it again. And by contrast, I have very little patience with whining about aging. You know, I'm not going to whine about my gray hair, and I am not going to whine about the fact that my face looks different than it did when I was 25 years old, because I know that if my mother could have lived long enough to have gray hair and wrinkles, she would have been happy to do so.
It's interesting you bring that up about grandchildren, because yes, it's almost a fresh turn of the knife in some ways when you think like, oh my gosh, they missed this.
Yeah.
Like, oh,
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
That's my next book.
Oh, okay, that's usually our last
I'm
question.
writing a book, a nonfiction book called Nana, about being a grandmother.
So is it every bit as amazing as everybody says?
You know, it's pretty great, but I'm not sure I find it great for exactly the same reason that other people do. I mean, for me, one of the single most thrilling parts of it has been what a spectacular father my son is. And frankly, I wouldn't have predicted that of him. In the same way that I wouldn't have predicted that I would have been an especially good mother, because I was very particular and very smart and very impatient and very egocentric. I was utterly transformed by motherhood, and he's been transformed in almost exactly the same way by fatherhood, which is just, as his mother, just so exciting to watch.
When you became a mother, you were still working in what really was a dream job or a dream accomplishment of a job, right? Mm-hmm. Your first 2 pregnancies, right? You were still in the newsroom, right?
I was deputy Metro editor during my first 2 pregnancies, yes. I was a terrifying figure. There had never been really any sort of central female character in the Times who had gotten pregnant. If I wanted to get a story on page 1, all I had to do in the page 1 meeting was start to hyperventilate a little bit, and they'd be like, put it out front.
That is so funny. And at that time, it doesn't seem like that would be so different at that time, but really it was.
Oh yeah, it was totally different. And then right afterwards, a whole bunch of my reporters got pregnant. My maternity clothes got passed around the newsroom like crazy. But it's because of a moment in time that it was. I mean, you know, this was in 1983. 77 was when a whole group of women got hired at the New York Times as part of a settlement of a class action suit. So suddenly the newsroom was filled with young women.
You were part of that wave?
I was part of that wave, and you know, 5, 6, 7 years later, we were all getting married and all having children, and you know, there we were.
I always say that it's the first generation where it was not necessarily a question of are you going to go to college, but you're going to college.
Right.
And that, as you have often written about, opened up a whole other bunch of things that no other generation of women had experienced.
Well, we're kind of, I'm 65, and we're kind of the straddle generation, in that when we were little girls, the expectations were still kind of 50s expectations.
True, I guess, yeah. I'm 1970, so
there
yeah,
might have been the expectation that we were going to go to college, but you know, maybe if we ever got a job, we would get a job as a teacher. But nobody ever said to me, hey, want to be a newspaper columnist? I mean, it just wasn't happening at that time.
That's true, and the expectation was that, yes, you would go to college, you get a degree, but that you would stop when you had children.
Exactly. And, you know, there had been one woman in the United States Senate. There had never been a woman on the Supreme Court. There had never been a woman who ran for president on a major party ticket. I mean, all these areas now that I don't think we entirely take them for granted, but certainly we know they all happen.
How cataclysmic it was.
It just wasn't happening then.
Right. And it's funny because then I graduated college in '92, and then the expectation was that, of course, you would work. You would definitely work, and you would set everything up so that you could work and you could have a baby. And then we were all finding out that that worked for some people, didn't work for all of us.
Well, look, I mean, the whole second wave feminism, which was the linchpin of my life, and yesterday was Gloria Steinem's birthday, and every year on her birthday I send her an email that says, thank you for my life. And I really mean it, because nobody has worked as tirelessly for freedom for women in America as Steinem has. But it's a dialectic. So, you know, you started out with this thesis, and it was woman as wife and mother. Bingo, end of conversation. And second wave feminism came along and came up with an antithesis. No wife, no mother, work, a life of the mind, pushing forward, being powerful. And like all dialectics, what you really needed was a synthesis, where people said, yeah, I'm going to be an op-ed page columnist, and I'm going to have these 3 kids. And when I get tired of doing the column, I'm going to do something else. And, if I want, I'll spend more time with the kids, that kind of thing. That one from column A, one from column B thing. The synthesis we didn't get around to was taking care of our less prosperous sisters, and that's what really needs to be done now. Feminism that includes, the Me Too movement was all about actresses who were horribly treated. I couldn't be happier about people coming forward and people being punished for their bad behavior. I worry all the time about waitresses, the people who clean hotel rooms, working poor women who can't afford to speak up and say something to the boss because they're one paycheck away from a shelter with their kids.
The development that really hit me was that New York Times series on the women who worked at Ford in Chicago.
But it still leaves you in a place where people say all the time, well, why didn't you say something? Well, I mean, if it's your livelihood, if it's a difference between being able to give your kids mac and cheese and not being able to give your kids mac and cheese, then there's a lot you can keep quiet about. And that's the part of it that people need to be more sensible and sensitive about. It's still really hard to be a poor woman in America, and that's a piece of feminism that we have to keep hammering away at.
You grew up in a really exciting time politically too, huge shifts happening, civil rights and women's rights, et cetera. Did that spark your interest in journalism, and I feel like back in that time people really read the paper. They really were very informed.
Well, I was from a family that always read the paper.
I grew up in that too.
We got 3 newspapers every day: the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and the Philadelphia Bulletin.
And it wasn't really a class thing. It was everybody.
Everybody did. Everybody did. But I didn't really have any interest in journalism. I wanted to be a novelist.
Oh, from the get-go.
Oh, yeah. When I was a kid, I really wanted to be a novelist. I loved Dickens, I loved Jane Austen, I loved Little Women, and I just wanted to be one of those people. But when I was in high school, I was editor of my school newspaper, and we won some awards from local dailies, and I got one of those places to give me a summer job as a copy girl. And my idea was I'd work in newspapers for 6 or 7 years and save enough money so that I could quit and write novels full time, except that when I got to be a reporter, I loved being a reporter so much that I just stayed and stayed and stayed. I mean, I still think a newspaper newsroom is one of the best places to work on earth.
What did you love about it?
Oh, the pace of it, and I loved the kind of grubbiness of it. I grew up with really good manners and a really nice family, and to be in a place where everybody swore and everybody drank, and the metabolism of the day is in some ways a kind of an ADD metabolism, which really works for me. So you get in at 10 o'clock and you talk to the people around you and nothing's happening. And then 11 comes, and maybe you make some calls, and you have a lunch, and all of a sudden at 2:30, Quindlen, come here. You got to go to Queens, and you hop on the subway and you go to Queens, and something's happening, and you take notes as fast as you can, and maybe, and now I will really date myself, maybe you dictate from a phone booth.
I have done that.
Or maybe you come back to the office and write your story, and then your story gets cut, and then you talk about how, nobody recognizes good reporting when they see it, if they think you can shoehorn it into 700 words, and then it's over. And then you start, there was a bust of Adolph Oakes who bought the New York Times in the 18-somethings in the lobby of the old Times building, and it said at the beginning, I think I'm getting this right, every day is a new beginning, every day is the world made new. And that's a great thing about newspapers. They're really forgiving in a certain way, although the Times is less forgiving than others because of the esteem in which it's held. But that sense that you get to the end of the day and the story's done and you start fresh tomorrow, I love that.
It crackles with.
Yeah, absolutely.
life.
And I loved street reporting too. I loved all the people I met and the places I went that I would never have gone otherwise. I mean, I remember being at Columbia Presbyterian, I guess in the mid-'70s, watching someone do a transplant, you know, all gowned up and everything, and thinking, I cannot believe this is my life.
I know this is an obvious question, but I feel it as a reader, maybe having been a reporter, but I feel like that background and those skills and that tightness and the powers of observation, I feel them in your novels. And I'd love to hear more about how your reporting background and those years inform your writing as a novelist.
I think being a reporter was the best possible preparation for being a novelist. And I know people don't understand how you make that shift because I'm asked about it so often, you know. Even some of my colleagues, I don't understand how you make it up, Anna. But I mean, what I was saying before about how it all becomes grist for the mill, all of those years of being a street reporter, you just learn things. You learn things about people, you learn things about neighborhoods, you observe things and they can't go into the story and you don't do anything with them and they go deep, deep into the brain pan and then 20 years later you pull them out in a novel. I mean, I learned how to write on demand, even when I didn't feel like writing, which is an invaluable tool for when you're writing a novel. I learned how people actually speak. I mean, you know, I read dialogue sometimes in a novel and I think, oh, spare me, really? I mean, nobody talks this way. And I fall into it sometimes, but I always catch it, and that's because of all those years of writing down what people said. I know how to keep it tight. I know how to, you know, fashion magazines say sometimes you get dressed and then you should take one thing off, because you always have one more thing on than you should be wearing. That's what writing a novel is about a lot of the times. You write the description, then you take one thing off or two things off, because you realize if you've got really strong telling details, they're more powerful if you don't surround them with a lot of other stuff. And having to write as tight as I did in the newspaper business, I was really good about figuring out which were the details that mattered and which not so much.
Getting out of the way.
Exactly.
When I read your novels, that's what I feel like, plausibility. I feel like, yes, that could happen.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, that's...
And it's what drives me nuts, as you said, in novels. I think that's not how that would happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, that's the only way to write a novel. I mean, that's why novels last. You know, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are about 220 years old now. And you read Pride and Prejudice and they're utterly real. That's complete magic. I mean, that's what I wanted when I was a kid. I wanted to be a magician, and here I am.
Before we go, I want to ask you about your fans. You have a huge fan base, people who've really grown up reading you. What's it like to meet them?
It's really humbling to meet people who are reading your stuff, in part because most of the time, you know, people make it sound as though I walk around constantly and people are fanning, hey, Anna. No. I mean, most of the time I'm alone in a little room. And I'm thinking, nobody's going to read this. This isn't as good as the last one. You know, it's all about confidence. And so when you do go out in the world and people say, I've read all 9 of your novels, well, I mean, that's just such a gift. And then you carry it back into that little room. And as you're working, you think, well, somebody's reading this.
Anna Quindlen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.